Good afternoon. Welcome to Remaking the Economy, How Policy Can Help Tenants Purchase Their Homes, a co-production of NPQ and Shelterforce. I'm Steve Dubb, my pronouns are he and him, and I'm Senior Editor of Economic Justice here at Nonprofit Quarterly, coming to you from Boston on land historically stewarded by the Massachusetts Nation.
And I'm Miriam Axel-Lute. My pronouns are she, her. I'm editor-in-chief of Shelterforce, a national publication that uses the power of journalism to support healthy, just communities with a special focus on affordable housing. And I'm coming to you from Albany, New York, in Mohican and Haudenosaunee territory.
For this webinar, we are honored to introduce four expert panelists who are Roshan Abraham is a journalist who has written widely on housing issues, both for Next City and Shelterforce. He's based in the Queensboro of New York City. José García is Associate Director of Preservation at the Mission Economic Development Agency, or MEDA, in San Francisco. Tram Hoang is a Senior Associate at PolicyLink, where she focuses on housing policy work. She also led a successful rent stabilization campaign in St. Paul, Minnesota in 2021. And Ellen Zurbrigg is co-executive director of Mi Casa Inc., an affordable housing development nonprofit focused on facilitating tenant opportunity to purchase their buildings based in Washington, D.C. A few notes. First, we're very excited to take your questions. Please enter your questions in the question box at the bottom of your screen, and Miriam and I will share as many of them as we can. You're welcome and encouraged to use the chat, but if you do have a question, please put the question in the question box. Second, we always get the question of whether we'll share the slides and recording after the webinar. Don't worry, we will. They're generally available by Monday. One last thing. We'd like to gratefully acknowledge our sponsor, Just Right Grants, which helps nonprofits fundraise with unique affordable grant writing subscriptions. Learn more at www.justrightgrants.com. Thanks for joining us. Please complete the brief survey after the webinar to inform our future work. And with that, I'll pass the baton to my co-moderator, Miriam, who will say a few words about the topic of today's webinar and then introduce our first panelist.
Thanks, Steve. So we're here today to discuss a type of policy that's generally known as opportunity to purchase laws. These policies put tenants, or in some cases, vetted nonprofits acting on their behalf, first in line to buy a building when it goes up for sale. You'll hear the terms TOPA and COPA, which are the acronyms. They stand for the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act and the Community Opportunity to Purchase Act, and that's how these policies are frequently referred to. So tenants exercising this right might form a co-op. They might partner with a nonprofit to manage their building and keep it affordable. In some cases, if they don't want to buy, they might negotiate other benefits. Opportunity to purchase can be a really powerful tool to prevent displacement and increase community control and level the playing field between tenants and powerful real estate players. It can also be a potential step toward racial equity, as a recent report from LISC pointed out. But it's also a complicated process that's only been enacted in a handful of places, and so learning from those places is really key in order to do it well in more locations. Our panelists today are going to give us some perspective on the promise, the vision, the wins, and the challenges of helping tenants buy their buildings. So I'm going to pass it to our first panelist, Tram from PolicyLink.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Tram Hoang. I use she, her pronouns. To provide a visual description, I'm a woman of Vietnamese descent in her 30s with long black hair, wearing a striped white shirt today. I am a senior associate on the housing team at PolicyLink, and I live in the Twin Cities in Minnesota on Dakota land. If you haven't heard of PolicyLink, we are a national research and advocacy organization that's focused on advancing racial and economic equity for the 100 million who live in poverty. And within that, our housing team, which I'm proud to be a part of, focuses on a variety of housing issues, ranging from fair housing to tenant protections and social housing to reparative approaches to achieving housing and land justice. Special thank you to Steve and Miriam for hosting us today. I'm especially excited to talk about TOPA and COPA policies for a few reasons that you'll hear about. I believe they're central to our team's work to shift control of land and housing away from speculative and extractive systems. And one of the ways I do that is through co-hosting a national TOPA-COPA network with my partners at the New Economy Project. And this is a space that's dedicated to organizers, housing advocates, and community members who are participating in active TOPA and COPA campaigns. And I've also created some resources about TOPA and COPA policies that are available on the PolicyLink website. They're on a slide that will be brought up in just a second. Thank you so much. So this is, I know you can't see this very well, but I'll put some links in the chat. This is a map of all of the TOPA-COPA campaigns taking place across the country, as well as policies that have been passed. And I think this is a helpful tool because we often think of TOPA-COPA as a, SFDC thing, but really the momentum is building. We're seeing campaigns across the country, and I'm sure there are campaigns I have yet to learn about because the energy continues to grow. So a little bit more about this map, policies at the city, county, state level. Here you can see that there are policies that are being implemented currently that have already passed, policies that are under consideration, so campaigns are being run to pass them, campaigns or policies that were previously considered, and as well as a policy that was repealed. And I'll just make a quick note. The only repeal we have here is one in Baltimore, where it was repealed to be replaced with a stronger ordinance, which has already happened. So that is a good sign. But I'll put the links in the chat so that folks can access our tools around TOPA-COPA. I think they're a good way to generally learn about what it takes to pass a policy, what it takes to implement it well, and the ongoing work that's needed to maintain TOPA-COPA as a sustainable housing tool. Thanks.
Great. Well, I will pass the baton to Roshan. And Roshan, if you could introduce yourself and talk about some of the work you've done in terms of writing on Tenant Opportunity Purchase, Community Opportunity Purchase Act, and so forth, and housing justice.
Yeah, sure. My name's Roshan Abraham. Pronouns he, him, or they, them. I reside in Queens, as you mentioned. I'm a freelance journalist. I predominantly write about housing policy right now. I write for Next City. We co-publish articles with Shelterforce, and I've freelanced all over the place on top of that. And I've written a lot about innovative, tenant-centered policies that preserve affordability, that work for preserving affordability, of which TOPA is, I think, one of the primary ones. And it's something that I think is getting more and more attention among tenant activists, just as a way to gain additional leverage in terms of their relationships to their landlords, and for the ability to obviously potentially purchase their homes, their apartments. But I think, as we'll talk about later in the seminar, that outcome, while ideal, is often rare. And I think we're all going to hopefully talk about ways to make that less rare. But yeah, I think, TOPA's not just something as a principle that like exists in the housing world we should mention. It's, I don't know how many states or cities have kind of like worker ownership analogs of TOPA, but I know that there are sort of like opportunities to purchase, companies for like to turn them into worker-owned co-ops, and I'm hearing a lot more about that as well. And I have people who are trying to, I know people who are trying to kind of push that forward as well, and are also looking to TOPA and trying to kind of find good examples of how these types of policies can work in different sectors of the economy. So yeah, I'm happy to be here with everyone today.
I'll just jump in. Hi, everyone. I'm Ellen Serbig, co-executive director of Mikasa Inc. And just a word about me, I've been involved in nonprofit affordable housing and community development for more than 25 years, originally from Chicago, but I prefer the mid-Atlantic winters. And I'm now hailing from Washington, D.C., which sits on the ancestral lands of the Anacostans, Piscataway, and Pamunkey peoples. I want to talk for a minute about DC TOPA and then talk about MICASA's work because it's integral. TOPA, or tenant opportunity to purchase, is integral to the affordable housing work that we do. So the DC TOPA law, I think, is one of the oldest in the country. It was formulated in 1980. It came out of the civil rights movement and the home rule movement of DC, very much connected to resident power, racial equity, economic equity, and it was focused mainly on the conversion of the use and sale and transfer of rental housing to tenant ownership and tenants accessing the first right of refusal and the right to purchase their buildings and preserve them as affordable housing in many shapes and forms. MICASA as an organization is driven by a vision of housing equity and a vision of housing as a human right, where everyone has access to quality, affordable housing in diverse, vibrant communities. And we do this through facilitating, advocating, and providing affordable housing for low-income communities. Our focus is in promoting equitable, thriving, and diverse neighborhoods in the greater DC area with an emphasis on non-displacement. And, you know, we started in the 90s, more than 30 years ago, when DC was a really different city, taking the boards off of vacant houses in neighborhoods that had seen decades of disinvestment. And as we've grown over time, with more and more focus on multifamily development from single family development, the city has also changed. Like many cities in America, it's become a very unaffordable, one of the most rapidly gentrifying cities, with great disparities in incomes and a severe shortage of affordable housing. And so how we pivoted was we provide more work with technical assistance and training to low-income tenant groups to exercise their first right to purchase under DC's TOPA Act. And in fact, a fun stat, there are a lot of limited equity co-ops that have been developed, more than 4,000 units since TOPA's inception. And MICASA in one way, shape, or form has been involved in developing about a third of them. So we really have had an imprint throughout the city in facilitating tenant ownership through TOPA. We also have evolved to do more affordable rental housing that way, because tenants can also assign their rights to purchase to a developer. And what's key for us there is the essential agreement with the residents that promises them better living conditions, affordable housing long-term, and the ability to remain in their neighborhoods and benefit from the resurgence and the redevelopment of their neighborhoods. The majority of the households we serve are low-income renters in DC, are majority BIPOC and below 30% and 50% of the area median income. So we have bilingual staff. We work with a lot of recent immigrants and long-term Black Washingtonians to ensure that they can remain in their neighborhoods as their neighborhoods change.
Thanks, Ellen. And I'll just say on a personal note that I actually lived in a TOPA building in DC for 7 years. So I've seen the value of that law. Let me pass the baton to Jose. Jose, could you introduce yourself and talk about the work of MEDA and how you're implementing the Community Opportunity Purchase Act in San Francisco?
Of course, thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is José García, and I'm the Associate Director of Preservation here at Mission Economic Development Agency, also known as MEDA, in San Francisco, California. Here at MEDA, we envision generations of Latinos choosing where to call home, thriving economically, succeeding in learning opportunities, and leading policy and social change toward a more equitable society. MEDA has actually been providing services to the community since 1973, but we established our community real estate team in 2014 in the response of displacements of our families. In the early 2000s, we lost approximately 25% of our Latino population in the Mission District. Since 2014, we've been able to produce or preserve, which is new construction, obviously acquisition and rehabs, approximately 1,300 units and another 900 in the pipeline. For preservation numbers, we've been able to acquire 36 buildings totaling to approximately 300 units. And thanks to the COPA legislation passed here in San Francisco in 2019, we've been, out of those 36, 14 buildings were COPA buildings. I'll kind of leave a little bit more space for other folks, but thanks for having me and looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all, and we're going to dive into some deeper questions now. So starting off with just how do these local policies work to help tenants buy apartment buildings from landlords and collectively own their property, or with COPA involving the nonprofits in that process? And how does having this right of first refusal really increase tenant power? Start with Ellen, maybe.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think essentially, first and foremost, it gives tenants negotiating power. It gives them a seat at the table. The private sector is not going to give them that seat without the law. And through that ability to sit at the table, they're able to negotiate better outcomes for themselves. So that might mean preserving their affordable housing. It might be improving quality of the housing. It sometimes could mean a cash payout that enables them to move to another place. Those are pretty infrequent in DC. But what we found, and also there is a great study that the Coalition for Nonprofit Housing and Economic Development in DC put out on TOPA outcomes, is that in more than half of the cases, the residents who exercise their rights to purchase were able to negotiate better outcomes for themselves, whether it was affordability or improved conditions for their buildings. Some residents do actually purchase their buildings, and so that is a conduit to get residents and renters to become owners of their buildings, forming cooperatives or condominiums. More commonly, in DC at least, residents will negotiate better terms with a buyer, and through having that seat at the table, they're able to have the voice and with legal support to really put in writing what those improvements are going to be, and assuring that they will be able to stay in their homes and to have affordable housing.
Yes, similar to that here in San Francisco, I think the only thing I can add, we were losing a lot of folks being displaced or evicted because all these were being sold off the market, or just sellers weren't willing to sell to us just because of our financing timelines. We were struggling doing anything less than 120 days close. So just to put it in facts, in numbers, is again, here in San Francisco, just in just this year, and we're not even we're halfway through, we've received 271 COPA notices in San Francisco. If it wasn't for this policy, we would have lost a lot more of these opportunities to keep people housed. But yeah, just wanted to add that.
Okay. Does anybody else want to go in on this question? If not, I'll go to the next one.
I'll add a little bit to
go
what
for it.
Ellen was saying. I think negotiation power for tenants is huge, and I also think an element of TOPA COPA is time, right? The main thing that these policies, whether TOPA, COPA, or advance notice of sale, they give tenants time, and time is crucial in a real estate market that moves quickly and heavily favors access to capital, which generally favors multifamily buyers over current tenants. I think the time also gives tenants the power to negotiate and actually influence what happens to the home for which they've been paying the mortgage and making the landlord's financial gain possible. It means they have the agency and choice to decide what happens to them. And it can mean buying the property with their neighbors, right? Like folks have said, it can also mean, which I think is equally important, negotiating the terms of sale, because not everyone will want to or must, right, have a goal of ownership, but we should all have agency and choice. So whether they are able to maintain affordability in their building, get and win long overdue repairs, extend move out dates to allow for smoother transition. All of those things I think are needs that tenants have deemed necessary for them to maintain housing stability, whether that's in the current building or elsewhere. And those are really important things that people can win when TOPA COPA policies exist.
Great, thanks. All right, I will move up to the next question, which I think follows pretty closely. So the question is really about policy implementation, and there's actually a question in the question box too about how does this actually work? So you get 271 notices. That's a lot. How many of those are you able to keep up with? But how do laws like the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act or Community Opportunity to Purchase Act work in practice, and what are sort of the tripwires in terms of implementation, and maybe some strategies to address those? So anybody want?
Yeah, I can get started. Yeah, 271 notices. That's a lot. Here at MEDA, we're a place-based organization, so we focus specifically in the Mission District. So that's how we initially filter all these COPA notices coming through. We do expand outside of the Mission District if a district supervisor or tenant organizations or tenants themselves come to MEDA and say, hey, we want you to purchase, we want to stay here, and we want you to purchase our property with the, I'll get into the financing later, the small sites program financing. But how it typically works for us, we get the notice. We have 5 days to express interest. The initial notice just gives you the address, the unit count, and the rents. That's all you get at the beginning. Sometimes you get the asking price, but sometimes they just give you the basic minimum. So in those 5 days, you have to submit interest. If you submit interest, that buys you another 25 days to submit an offer. During this time, you have to, which is not enough. That's totally unless you've been doing this for a while, it's not enough, because you need to get your financing straight. You need to make sure that the tenants are on board and you get all their incomes, the leases. So you need all of this in as soon as possible. So in the 25-day, you have to submit an offer. If you don't meet that timeline, you lose the opportunity to purchase that property. No. But if you do submit an offer before that 25th day, you get the right of first refusal. What does that mean in context? So imagine the building's up for $2 million and you can your offer is $1.5 million, close in 120 days. They say, no, we want something different. They can go to the private market. They can figure out whatever deal they want to figure out, but they have to come back to us and say, hey, I have an offer for $2 million, closing in 120 days. If we can meet those terms, we have the opportunity to purchase and proceed with that purchase of that building. So that's typically how the process works, and I'll open it up for other folks to share.
Jose, there's a question in the chat I thought you might want to just respond to briefly about, do you guys get special notice or is it public notice? Just to explain how that works.
Yes, here in San Francisco, actually, you have to register with the city of San Francisco as a qualified nonprofit. So right now, initially in 2019, there was 5 qualified nonprofits. To date, last time I checked, was 26 qualified nonprofits. Not all of them are active because they're just getting into affordable housing and housing development, but you have to register with the city. You get approved for 3 years, and then they have to mail that notice to everyone on that list. That is usually the process that they have to take.
Great. Ellen, were you trying to get in? I think somebody was trying to get in. So, yeah, okay, Roshan.
I can weigh in. Yeah. And I think we should clarify for everyone, when we say negotiating power, specifically what we're referring to is the fact that not only do tenants and or nonprofit organizations get the right to purchase, they can then sell that right to purchase to third parties, which often could be the incoming landlord, which could be a private market landlord, or it could be a nonprofit landlord, or it could be a nonprofit that's helping you to facilitate some kind of community ownership. And I think we were talking a little bit about, even before we started, kind of the difference between TOPA and COPA. And for, I guess, anyone in the audience who isn't sure, like my understanding of the main difference is basically that community opportunity purchase, it usually gives that opportunity to purchase to qualified nonprofits or community organizations, whereas TOPA requires there to be a tenant organization created within the building that is going up for sale, and there has to be some kind of consensus among those tenants. So a city or state, I think in theory, could have both of those. I think in New York, there's an attempt to get a citywide TOPA and then like a statewide COPA law. I'm sure there are ways in which those two policies would interact that I can't speak to right now, but I think that in some way they could probably complement each other, especially since like if you're a tenant and your tenant association has the opportunity to purchase, like you can sell that to a nonprofit essentially, and they can buy the building and give you help to facilitate community ownership, which is one path that people have gone down.
Thanks. Anyone else want to weigh in on this?
Well, I would just like to add that in DC, since the TOPA law has been in existence for so long, it's part of the fabric of development. And that is actually why it's so integral to our work, because we can utilize it. We see it as a really viable tool for creating and preserving affordable housing. But for market rate developers, they're also very aware of TOPA. I'm not saying everyone loves TOPA. And Jose, I think your timeline in San Francisco is far, far shorter than the TOPA timeline in DC, which is, still a difficult timeline to meet sometimes, because you are working with resident groups and convening people after hours who are volunteering their time, trying to feed their children at the same time, or coming home from work. And so one of the key pieces in DC is we have a strong infrastructure of nonprofit housing counselors that do get notices, and they go out to buildings and they do a lot of the footwork, they're on the ground footwork to reach out to residents and ensure that residents know what their rights are. Because a lot of people, even though TOPA is widely known in the by developers, a lot of residents don't actually know that they have the right to purchase. And so there is a knowledge curve that needs to be built very quickly. And then tenants have 45 days to register their intent to purchase, and another 120 days to submit an offer, which is extendable based on financing. I would say that in DC, we've also closed some of the transfer loopholes. So there have been some ways that developers have gone around TOPA, and some of those loopholes have been closed. The biggest one now that's kind of on our hit list is advocating for a cooling off period during that first 45 days, because even though tenant associations do have 45 days to register their intent to purchase, there are still some, let's say, not our favorite developers who go out, into the buildings at night over the weekends and talk to the tenants and offer usually some money or compensation to sign away their rights within that period of time. And so we think it's essential that residents have that period of time to be able to speak, or at least, that it's required that they meet with housing counselors at least once to understand what their rights are and have the full range of choices put out before them before they lose them.
Great. Anyone else want to weigh in on this? Okay, so we're going to move in this, and we've started to head in this direction anyway, so we're going to take it a little farther, which is one of the key questions in all of this, is how do tenants move from having this abstract right to purchase to actually the ability to purchase? And this gets into the money side of it, right? Because a group of usually low-income tenants don't just have the ability to purchase a building sitting ready to go. So how do we make this go from abstract to practical?
I can get us started. That is the $1 million question that we always get asked. How can you acquire all these properties, especially if you're acquiring some properties from the 1900s that with a lot of deferred maintenance, because we're under rent control here in San Francisco. But thankfully, before COPA was passed, the city of San Francisco passed this program called Small Sites Program. That itself is the only way we've been able to achieve the purchase and keep folks housed in our 36 buildings. How that works, the Small Sites Program actually provides a soft loan. It's a residual receipt loan, and it ranges anywhere from $350,000 per unit to $500 per unit max if you're adding an additional dwelling unit. So if you're converting two garage spaces into a unit, they can give you that subsidy up to $500,000. That is the only way that we can do it. So how it's typically a deal is done here in San Francisco under Small Sites Program. You have all your rents, you have all your operating expenses. So you size your hard debt, so your first mortgage, as much as you can afford. Let's say you can only afford $5 million, and the total development cost for that property is you can only afford $5 million, and the total development cost is $10 million. So typically, if you fall under the guidelines, depending on the unit mix, if it's for example, studios is 350 or 375, then it continues to grow. If you fit in that SSP margin, then that covers the rest. That covers your gap. And I was like, okay, well, when do you have to pay that? It's just a residual receipts loan. So how the city allows you to do is you're paying your first mortgage, whatever your debt is, and at the end, once you're done paying your first mortgage and all your operating expenses, if you have any cash flow from that, before you even pay that soft loan, they make sure that your reserves are done. Because this program actually not only gives you money to do all the rehab at acquisition, but also make sure that all the capital improvements are incorporated in your replacement reserves for the next 20 years. So they want to make sure that your replacement reserves are properly funded. And then if you have any more money after that, then you pay 1/3 of that back to the city of San Francisco. So that's under the Small Sites Program. I can add the link in the chat so you guys can get a little bit more details about the program. But yeah, that's how we're doing it right now. And that was established in 2013, 2014. And because we were losing so many opportunities to keep our families in place, 2019, that's what COPA legislation passed, and it's been a roller coaster since then.
So as I said before, key is that we have this amazing infrastructure of nonprofit on the ground housing counselors. We also have too few excellent attorneys who work with and protect tenant rights. And so getting those folks involved very early in the process enables residents to make sound decisions with all the information about what is available to them in terms of options, right? Whether it is assigning their rights and negotiating terms with a third-party developer, whether it is direct purchase or some other outcome. And generally, it's the housing counselors and the attorneys that will then bring in groups like Mikasa, like the development consultants that can analyze the feasibility of a direct purchase or forming a co-op and analyze the resident incomes, what's needed to preserve affordability at affordable rent levels for the residents, and then what subsidy sources or financing sources are needed, and basically creating a development plan. And if it looks like a feasible plan, the residents can then either move forward with direct purchase. If the plan doesn't look as feasible, they might opt to assign their rights to a third-party developer and negotiate that way. And then again, that falls back on the technical assistance of housing counselors and attorneys. DC used to have basically a one-stop shop for tenant opportunity to purchase financing. It was housed in our Department of Housing and Community Development. It was called the First Right to Purchase program. It's still on the books, but it has not been utilized for many years. There's some pros and cons about a program like that. What it did was enable a gateway to tenants who are interested in direct purchase to access permanent acquisition financing at very low cost. So a cash flow loan payable only on what you have available out of cash flow at the end of the year, with very favorable terms and a long-term affordability covenant. Used to be 10 or 20 years, and now it's 40 or 50 years with the public, along with the public financing. And that support would also make available, in the previous model, renovation financing that would allow residents who purchase their buildings to fully renovate them and stabilize the conditions of the property, improve them, and have a long-term viable asset that they could preserve over many years as affordable housing. The model has changed in recent years. DHCD has outsourced the acquisition fund to a bridge loan fund, which is a preservation loan fund. And that is available for tenant opportunity to purchase projects, whether it's a developer purchasing or the residents purchasing and forming a limited equity co-op, which is the most common model here in DC. There are challenges with it, in that projects will have to carry the interest for a period of some years. Built into the loans are usually some costs for critical repairs to stabilize the building conditions, and then also provide pre-development funding that will allow them to hire architects in their development team and then apply for takeout and permanent financing. Gap financing is always needed. So public financing is always needed in affordable housing projects, and particularly now as housing development gets more and more expensive, and resident incomes are not, are stagnant or not increasing at such a rapid rate. And so what people can afford to pay and the total development costs it's really staggering how big the gap is growing and how much subsidy is needed. Sometimes 80% or 90% of subsidy is needed to ensure affordability in tenant purchase projects. And so when the projects that have bridge loans have to compete with other developers in a competitive bid process, they often don't score well. So the challenges that we see going forward with tenant opportunity to purchase is to sort of bring back this path, if you will, for direct tenant purchase, or a viable means of getting these projects to permanent acquisition financing, that will assure residents that if they go that path, that they will actually have the funding sources that they need to be able to purchase and stabilize their buildings.
Okay. Roshan, did you want to jump in on this one before we go to the next question?
I just want to add one more thing before the next question. So like I shared the small sites program, the issue we ran into that is that City of San Francisco also only had so much capacity, right? And we were seeing all these properties coming on the market and losing these properties. So together with the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development here in San Francisco and a CDFI known as San Francisco Housing Accelerator Fund was, I don't know when it started. I think it was 2017, 2018. And what it allowed us to do is acquire faster. So with San Francisco Housing Accelerator Fund, you would be able to close down a property in 60 to 90 days compared to the 120. It also provides you over 100% LTV because you're acquiring the property, you're getting the construction loan with San Francisco Housing Accelerator Fund. So they give you, I've worked on a deal with San Francisco Housing Accelerator Fund at 160 LTV. That's, I haven't found it anywhere else. So that San Francisco Housing Accelerator Fund has been key. And how they work is they work alongside with the city. City provides them a commitment letter saying, hey, once you acquire it, stabilize this property, rehab it, stabilize it, we'll come in with the permanent financing. So that process allows us to preserve a lot more housing faster and more efficiently. So I just wanted to share that, how San Francisco Housing Accelerator Fund is involved here in San Francisco.
Thanks. And just a reminder, like I put LTV, loan to value, in but like, let's try to like say the entire phrases if we're, rather than go to jargon if we can. I do want to go to the next question, I think, which is, what are the sources of resistance to these policies? I know there are efforts to whittle away them by having exemptions in the law, all sorts of different tactics. It was mentioned about going door to door to get tenants to sign away rights. There's obviously areas of resistance. And how do housing advocates and tenants respond to these to protect those rights?
So this is a big topic that we discuss in our national network because, we have campaigns across the country that are trying to advance these policies. And the main source of resistance to TOPA and COPA policies, but really any tenant protection policy, is the real estate lobby and their ideologies. And so with that, I really recommend reading a report that just came out from Americans for Financial Reform. It's called Who is Behind the Curtain? It breaks down the really powerful relationships across the real estate industry that kind of reveal the chokehold that the lobby has in our housing policy efforts. So I will say the two main issues that the real estate lobby have with TOPA-COPA policies are generally who the buyer is, right, and time. Those are the two things that TOPA and COPA try to impact and intervene in. And one thing I want to make clear is that TOPA and COPA do not impact the purchase price, right? There's nothing in TOPA-COPA that says, oh, real estate owners have to sell the property at a lower price. That's a very common myth that we want to correct. So the price of the building is not changed at all. The two elements that are changed are the buyer and time. So if we consider time, sure, of course, the real estate lobby wants things to move as quickly as possible because time is what makes our policy interventions possible. And they want to speed up the process to ensure that their advantage of fast-moving capital is protected. Now, changing the buyer is where we have to dig a little bit deeper, right? Because in any real estate transaction, expanding the pool of potential buyers is actually desired. More buyers, more competition, higher prices. And that's exactly what TOPA does. It actually expands the pool of buyers to tenants and COPA to preservation buyers. But for some reason, which I think we all have suspicions about why, the real estate lobby wants to prevent tenants from being potential buyers. And this requires us to question very deeply held beliefs and assumptions about property ownership. So why is it that we think different people are worthy of housing stability or capable of controlling their housing futures, right? Why is the real estate industry so appalled with the idea of tenants who have been paying the mortgage, owning their homes? I think we have to think about how housing and land exclusion are very racialized in nature, are sewn into the fabric of our institutions, of our policies, of our value systems. And in this fight, we are trying to allow renters who are disproportionately Black, Indigenous, and people of color to collectively own property. So we're not just up against $1 billion lobby, we're also working to shift paradigms of race and property ownership. But to the question of how people are responding, I think that tenants are very powerfully questioning those racist beliefs through a lot of narrative work and talking about the benefits of tenant ownership by not just talking about the benefits to tenants, but also sharing stories of the impact of collective ownership on entire communities. Because we know that everyone thrives when people stay stably housed in communities of their choice. And systems of collective care and land stewardship have been with us in our roots, with our ancestry, right, have been created and used for generations. And so we know how to take care of one another and interact with land in a way that isn't just wealth extraction. And TOPA is an extension of that care. And that's the story that I think tenants and advocates are doing a really powerful job of telling.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think that was a great assessment. I also think like there is this sort of like broader kind of almost like disaster capitalism intervention that seems to happen. It happened during the pandemic. It happened after the 2008 crisis, where anytime there's some like downward trend in real estate prices, or there's a lack of development, or like there isn't enough housing being produced, that's used as a excuse to kind of like crack down on policies that really have nothing to do with any of those things. I think specifically in DC, there have been successful attempts to whittle down TOPA in the past few years. There was an exemption for single family homes, I believe in 2018 or 2019. No one I spoke to who had studied TOPA for years could figure out what the basis for that was. There wasn't any data showing that TOPA had reduced the production of single family homes, but there was an exemption anyway for single family homes. And there was also, after 2020, I think it was maybe last year, there was another exemption specific for new development in the downtown area of DC. So it hasn't, the exemption, I think, hasn't necessarily played out yet because it's for new development, but it, again, there wasn't really any evidence that in downtown DC, TOPA had been restricting any kind of development. But, obviously all across the country during the pandemic, there was, downtown areas faced a lot of leases being canceled, and companies not putting their employees there, and there was just sort of like panic from a lot of elected officials. And very often the elected officials, they are quick to sort of adopt the narrative of real estate developers and other business folks who want to sell them sort of a quick fix without any kind of data to support that. So so I think those are sort of like the big forces, and I think that anyone who implements any kind of TOPA will probably face kind of continued attempts to whittle away at it. And I think that sort of grabbing the narrative first and sort of addressing it directly is probably the best approach, because very often the legislators are not really reading the studies or reports or anything at all in some cases.
Ellen, do you want to jump in at all? I mean, you're in DC, so you have a perspective on this, I'm sure.
I mean, I think that what Roshan is saying is right. I think that we work across multi-sector coalitions with the Coalition for Nonprofit Housing and Economic Development and Housing Association of Nonprofit Developers and other working groups and coalitions. And there is a general sense that the economy is particularly challenging. There's a sense among nonprofit housing developers as well as for-profit housing developers that this cycle of intense income disparity is creating even more intense pressure on low-income households and affecting their ability to pay, and affecting, and that development at the same time, development costs are dramatically increasing. So again, you have the gap needed to fill that to make housing truly affordable growing. And at the same time, you have budgets and funding with more limitations because loss of revenue, some of the points Roshan made, loss of office revenue, loss of office leases, and disinvestment, because mainly after effects of the pandemic. One of the other effects of the pandemic is that because TOPA basically froze during the pandemic, and so because it wasn't safe for residents to convene public meetings, and so it made sense, or to housing counselors to go out to buildings, and that the effect it had was to dramatically stall, maybe for 2-3 years, some developments, some multifamily developments. And I think there are developers that are still sort of reeling from that process, but it really was a temporary process. And so I think it is important to look at holistically at, like, what are the true issues, what are the things that are actually standing in the way. Oftentimes it's not TOPA. oftentimes it's other factors. And so having that very open dialogue about, how we can create policy solutions and funding solutions that aren't just like, we need to throw more subsidy at it. We need to increase the amount of subsidy. We need to get smart. We need to use different sources. We need to, increase density. We need to think of other ways that we can spur affordable housing development without taking away this fundamental right, which has been so instrumental in preserving and producing affordable housing for very low income residents.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Ellen. So want to move on. We've talked about the value to tenant power of these policies, but let's hone in specifically on how they promote ongoing housing affordability.
Cool. I can start us off. So for COPA, on the rental side, once you access any of these funds from the city of San Francisco, the property is deed restricted for the next 75 years. What does that mean for the tenants? It's usually when we acquire the property, we do not. The program wants folks to be at from 20 to 30% rent burden, but at acquisition, you want to make sure that they're somewhere around that range, and then once that rent is set, the max increase is anywhere from 2 to 3.5%, depending on the operating expenses. But that is the max increase going forward. That is a little bit over the rent board increase, the average rent board increase here in San Francisco. So that's typically something that tenants are afraid when they see that 3.5 versus the 2.5 yearly increase. But what the program does offer to make sure that the tenants don't ever have to pay any capital needs pass-throughs, we budget, us as the nonprofit are responsible to maintain their home for the next 20 years of that loan. So any upkeeping, any structural, anything that happens in their building, they do never get a pass-through, and it's covered through our loan with the city of San Francisco.
Ellen, go ahead. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. With tenant opportunity to purchase and the accompanied public financing that will keep buildings affordable, DC also utilizes deed restrictions. So it's been a 40 or 50-year affordability covenant. There are some folks that are promoting a longer term for that. So that one-time investment in public financing can create essentially perpetual affordability. Some co-ops have also partnered with land trusts. There's also a movement to combine tenant opportunity to purchase with publicly held land, to layer on mechanisms and stewardship mechanisms that will ensure that properties stay affordable for longer. And also rental subsidy can be a part of the development, that we do have a local rent subsidy that can be another layer that can ensure that whatever residents can afford to pay, that they're always paying roughly 30% to 40% of their incomes. And I think the key piece is just that the investment and the keeping it affordable over time in some ways decommodifies makes the housing non-commodified, so it's not subject to the fluctuations of the market, and the housing costs are more predictable over time with small increases, whether it's like consistent with rent control. They will inevitably, 10, 20, 30 years later, you do see cooperatives that were developed under TOPA that have significantly lower carrying charges, for better or for worse, for the operations of the building, but really provide a true affordability for the resident incomes living in the building. So I think, those are some of the ways that TOPA really does ensure ongoing housing affordability.
Great. Tram, maybe you can add a little bit to that, and then also talk about, you're working in a lot of different cities, right? With the coalition. So if you're starting a new policy, what lessons are you drawing from places like San Francisco and DC to do it better, if you will?
Sure. So I'll start with the ongoing promoting ongoing housing affordability. So with that, I see TOPA and COPA as both an offensive and defensive housing strategy. The defense is more obvious, right? We think about how tenants use TOPA or COPA to defend themselves against displacement. But I think the offensive strategy is something that we need to think about at a regional, state, and federal scale, which is leveraging tenant and community ownership to actively combat the increased concentration of ownership of our local housing stock in the hands of private equity and corporate landlords. I'm sure we've all seen the reports about how corporate landlords, who are often financed by private equity firms, are more likely to evict and displace tenants. They have more predatory property management practices, increase rent at a higher rate. And private equity now represents over half of the financial backing amongst the 35 largest owners of multifamily buildings. And this is a huge problem. So the direct acquisition of low rent buildings through laws like TOPA and COPA are one of the most direct tools that we have to push back against this trend, especially since we know that low rent buildings and homes in disinvested neighborhoods are more likely targeted due to their potential rent growth. As to the question about, as we're talking to other cities and states about how they're building out their policies, I'd put it under 4 categories in terms of like building the right ecosystem for the policy, because the policy must exist with infrastructure. I think the first bucket, which has the most to do with policy, is clear timelines for notice and acquisition. And I think DC having the longer timeline obviously is the longer the better, right? The more time the better. To know how much time tenants have to organize, to make an offer, to get funding, all of that. I think the second part of the ecosystem that's very important is technical assistance across the spectrum. Not only are we talking about public education and awareness so that tenants know what their rights are, but we also need legal support so that they can navigate the real estate transaction, and then funding for tenant organizing so that they can actually have the capacity to organize to buy their building or negotiate. The third piece is financing. So as folks have talked about, there's pre-development financing, acquisition, rehab or construction, and then the long-term permanent financing. And all of that needs to be considered as you're designing a policy, and more importantly, a program for implementation beyond that. And then the last piece that I think, we're so concerned with saving the property in the first place that we often forget we need long-term support for building management and sustainability. I think UHAB in New York City is a great organization to look at in terms of an organization that supports, it's a cooperative housing organization that supports tenant co-ops in owning, managing their building, whether that means, figuring out property management duties or calculating shared equity, or how do we finance capital improvements. Those are all big decisions that people should receive guidance on, and that's a big consideration for building out a policy and program.
Great. Ellen, I think you've written a bit about this too. Any thoughts you have on this topic about, what are some lessons you would take from DC that you would advise other communities to take into consideration?
Sure. Yeah, I think Tram, you hit the nail on the head in terms of the first line of defense, which we call it, which is, the housing counselors and the tenant organizers and technical assistance providers. Excuse me. In DC, there is grant support for some organizations, sorry, doing this work on the ground. The funding always comes up during the budget cycles, and sometimes it shifts or it changes, but I think consistent funding of the work is really important, and also growing it to meet the growing need. So, it's always at risk, and I think it's been cut or at risk of being cut many times in recent history. We have a lot to learn from the TOPA law in DC after almost 45 years. There are so many lessons, and I think that folks around the country who are developing TOPA and COPA laws have reached out to folks in DC to learn from our experience. It's far from perfect. It's been utilized well over the years, and I think one of the key, I guess I've written about the key piece being coordination between government agencies and nonprofit and technical assistance providers on the timing of when buildings are becoming available for sale, and on when funding would be available and what funding would be available, and then really creating. We have some good policies. We have a local housing production trust fund. We have community development finance institutions that are providing bridge loans and pre-development grants and loans. We have an infrastructure to support affordable housing development under TOPA. And yet, in recent years, it's been less effective than, in the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years, there have been much fewer tenant associations exercising their rights, fewer limited equity co-ops being formed. And it is, a method of home ownership that's accessible to very low income BIPOC renters that has a strong kind of future component of shaping the stake of, and the ownership stake in the city, to be owned by the residents themselves. So how do we get to more, promoting more of this? I think it takes both changes in policy and then coordination, like I said, between government agencies and nonprofits, and the resident groups themselves, as well as funding and smart funding. So like how do we're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars each project on bridge loan interest, and that those loans get taken out by public sources that then are paying $500 to $1 million more in total development costs of public financing. If we could figure out an acquisition tool that doesn't burden the project with that level of interest, whether it's like the first right to purchase loans that used to be a permanent soft loan payable based on available cash flow, that then you can add private financing to it. You can add some additional public funds for building renovations, but just thinking about this smartly so that we can really use public dollars wisely, and plan over the years based on when buildings become available. So I think it really takes critical coordination and commitment to making sure that tenant opportunity to purchase will facilitate affordable housing development.
Great. Thanks, Ellen. We had a couple questions early on from folks who wanted to hear a little bit more about the ways that tenants negotiate better terms and conditions with a non-qualified purchaser, or negotiate what outcomes there are that are not purchasing the property and what that can look like. If anybody wants to address that.
Mikasa has negotiated with tenant associations to assign their rights to Mikasa to preserve affordable rental housing. And what that looked like was many meetings with the residents over time, and with their attorney and with housing counselors, and essentially hearing from them what they valued, what was important to them. And so not to overgeneralize, but in general, the things that were important to them are, you can imagine, important to all of us, right? So safety, improved safety, quality of life, improved heating and cooling, improved building conditions, and affordability. And then, I would say first and foremost, all of the tenants that we meet with, the first thing that is of vital importance to them is, I want to stay in my home. I want to stay in my neighborhood. This is where I work, my kids go to school, this is where I go to church, this is where I have family, I have friends. This is important to me. So how can I stay here? And in some cases, there isn't an interest in forming a cooperative, and people are clear about that they just want to maintain their affordable rental housing. And so we will negotiate a development agreement with them, and that clearly spells out in writing what it is we're committing to the residents. Like, very specifically, who are the residents, how are they going to benefit, what the affordable rent levels will be, because we've done assessment of resident incomes and we've set the affordable rent levels based on those incomes. And in addition, we commit to improving the building conditions and to long-term affordability. And so those are some of the things that are spelled out in that agreement very explicitly. And I think that's key because residents can be assured that those things are going to happen.
Great, thanks. I think there's a question from the audience I want to get at is like, how many families benefit? So I know the number of TOPA residents in DC is certainly in the thousands, after 40 years of policy, but give a sense of scale. Also in San Francisco with COPA, how many people I think I heard 300 from MEDA, but if you could give a sense of scale and how many families are affected, and maybe tell a story if you have like an example too, because I think that this can get really technical and yet it's really vital for people's well-being. So anything you can, any actual anecdotes you can provide of how this has made a difference in people's lives would be appreciated too. So I'll throw it to Jose first for San Francisco and then back to Ellen.
Yeah, I'll actually tell a story of how it can change folks' lives. It was our initial 2 COPA deals, but 300, I would have to check. It was a little bit over 100 units for COPA actual acquisitions, but I don't know how that translates to the number of families, but I'll find that after I answer this question. But a big part of this is like, once we got the note, like for example, these first 2 deals, we get a COPA notice. We reach out to the tenants because it's tenant-driven process. If tenants don't want us to purchase their home, it's all right. Good luck. Here are any eviction defense. If some folks want to take the buyout, I've heard buyouts here in San Francisco from tenants anywhere from $40,000 to $60,000 for them to move out. But a good story is we got COPA notices. We found out families are living in a studio of five household family is living in a studio. Parents are living in the closet. Kids are studying during COVID. They're living, studying, going to school, eating, doing everything at home in one studio. So we were able to acquire the first 2 COPA properties. And in one of the COPA properties, there was a vacancy of a 3-bedroom, which we were able to acquire, rehab, and being able to relocate it into another COPA property after the rehab was complete, for them to live a good quality of life. So that's just one of the stories that we were able to do. Another one I can share that is very touching for me, because it was actually one of my first projects here at MEDA, is we're able to transfer through different during the acquisitions, during the SF half phase, folks like, for example, elder that was amputated, that he was actually pulling himself upstairs to go into his unit. We were able to transfer it to another site that actually had an elevator. So those are the stories that we're able to do when we get to contact the tenant, communicate with the tenants. If it wasn't for those notices, we don't even get an opportunity to call the tenants. How are you doing? Your property is going for sale. Do you want to stay here? We can work with you. So if it wasn't for getting those notices, there's probably a lot of those stories that we could have supported some of our community members.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just throw out a stat, because I think it's pretty impressive that over time, DC TOPA has enabled the development and preservation of more than 16,000 affordable housing units. And then, the 99 limited equity co-ops, or more than 4,000 units of affordable limited equity cooperatives in the district, the majority of those were formed under TOPA. But there's so many amazing stories. I think that one is kind of the little engine that could. It was a really small project. We work on projects that get the notice of sale from 5 units to 99 units and up. But that's, typically we're working in most of DC's affordable or naturally occurring affordable housing, or NOAA, is, 20 or 30 unit buildings. But these were townhomes in an area very close to the DC Housing Authority, and that residents who were had public housing vouchers were living in them. And folks who had been living them for many, many years had raised their kids, and now grandmother was raising her grandkids in 2 of the houses. And we're used to being told, that if they have to move, they believe, once they're told they have to move, they believe it. And so there were actually times, I think several times, and not all funny, but like several times when they were packing up to move, thinking that they had to leave because they got the notice of sale. And a lawyer, I believe it was from Bread for the City, knocked on one of their doors. So they love to tell this story. And it wasn't for her saying, no, you don't have to move. You have rights, you have options. They wouldn't have known that, and they wouldn't have exercised their rights to purchase. And what they actually did was they worked with Mi Casa to form a limited equity co-op that was financed using local money, federal money, and then also enhanced Section 8 vouchers that gave them the income that they needed to operate the townhomes as a cooperative, still in existence today. So I think, that's reflective of a lot of these stories. There are many amazing stories about how the residents came together and were able to organize and form a cooperative through many impediments, but ultimately seeing it through and celebrating, that they were able to not only preserve their affordable housing, but really build a strong community and a strong association through the process, and get to know their neighbors, and get to feel a sense of like a shared sense of both responsibility and values and importance of the work that they were doing together to preserve their homes.
I have a quick follow-up
Yeah, go, Tom.
question for Ellen regarding negotiations. So I'm wondering, when, let's say the building's being sold and the tenants want to negotiate, but it's not with a buyer like Mi Casa, right? It's a private buyer, not a qualified nonprofit. Like I guess, what advice do you have for tenants who are in that position with the negotiation where, you don't have a values aligned buyer who is going to sit down and give you a seat at the table? Like, what is the hook, or how do tenants get those buyers to recognize their power in those situations?
I can share a little bit. We don't have much here at MEDA because we just don't get advice of providing any legal advice. But we do have tenant organizations that we obviously partner and work with on many deals, where we just connect them to that tenant rights organizations and legal. Most CD here in the city of San Francisco does have a budget for any LSAC eviction proceedings, so we just connect them with those attorneys. But we try to stay away from any especially any legal advice from our community real estate team.
Yeah, I would echo that. That we work with very effective TOPA attorneys who are knowledgeable and can advise residents, and one or two of whom, were responsible basically for co-authoring the DC TOPA law. So it's those folks that we turn to, in times where there needs to be clarity according to the law.
We have a question that very specific about in your various programs, what is considered affordable? Is it defined? Is it how is, when we're talking about keeping these properties affordable, what are we talking about?
Yeah, I think that different people define affordability differently, and that is a really good question. Jose, go ahead and jump in if you want.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a tough question because when I share the numbers here in San Francisco, it's kind of sad. But the program actually is trying to reach an 80% average AMI affordability in the long run, right? We set their rents, even if they're paying 30% AMI. Ideally, how we set up the pro forma is for them to ideally at some point the building reach 80% AMI. 80% AMI in San Francisco for a family of four is $119,000 a year. So that is what it's doing. But right now in the Mission District, what we're seeing is anywhere from 30 to 60% AMI, and 60% here in San Francisco for a family of four is $90,000. So that's what the program's trying to achieve, 80% AMI in the long run, but we keep their rents at where they're at. If they're at least 20% rent burden, they stay where they're at, and a maximum of 3.5% increase going forward. And that's for Copa and San Francisco, and small sites program in San Francisco.
When we look at developing affordable housing under TOPA, we start with income surveys of residents to identify who's living in the building and what is affordable to them. That's not what everyone does, but we do that because it is important to identify what people can afford to pay and what will be sustainable for them, and to ensure the success for them and for the housing stability in the future. We do find that on average, the buildings that we work with, the income levels in DC rental buildings that we work with, some of the smaller buildings, are somewhere between 30% of area median income and 50% of area median income. DC region has a high median income. It's more than 150,000. So what that means for a family of four is below 30% is about 45, give or take. The new guidelines might have just come out. And 50% for a family of four is about 76,000.
And I just wanted to add the rent amounts that we see here. So for that 80% that I was speaking about, for a family of four, right? Hopefully they're living in a 2-bedroom. We're talking about 80% of median income without utilities is approximately $2,600 a month. So while the 90,000 that I shared might seem doable when you're comparing them to the rent amounts, it's very tough.
Yeah, and Jose, just what's like the standard 1-bedroom apartment? It's like over 4,000 or something in San Francisco. It's kind of crazy.
At 100% AMI in San Francisco without utilities is $2,555. 100% AMI.
Got it. All right. Well, I wanted to ask a question here. This was upvoted a lot. So, and we've talked about it in some ways, but the question is, I was a listener wanting to have you guys speak to the broader funding and programmatic infrastructure needed beyond opportunity to purchase. I know Miriam and I have hosted conversations on social housing before, but obviously this is one piece of an ecosystem to actually make housing affordable and make home ownership more accessible to more people. But how do you think of this in the larger frame of housing justice?
I think one of the things we can try to do is, you mentioned home ownership, but achieving home ownership is much easier relatively, right? Of course, there are weaknesses of our home ownership structure as well, than tenant and collective ownership. And so I actually think that one of the largest industries we can take lessons from is the home ownership industry, even with its flaws. And I'll tell you why. So when I was a renter and became lucky enough to be in a position to buy a home, I was very nervous about the process. And then I met with a realtor, and it felt like I was on a lazy river to home ownership, right? You have realtors, you have lenders, you have title officers, escrow officers. Every piece is in place to guide you towards owning your home. And it can take weeks, right? And at the same time, I was reading about an effort in Minneapolis where tenants were trying to purchase their building from their slumlord whose rental license had been revoked by the city. And this was years in the making. So in many ways, I compare like my and many people's experience of like the lazy river of home ownership. And I compare that to tenant or cooperative ownership, which feels like whitewater rafting upstream. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves is not, why is it so hard for tenants to get their stuff together and figure out how to buy their building? It's really, why haven't we invested the resources, the millions of dollars, the decades in building an infrastructure for tenant or community ownership? that compares to or equals the machine that we have created for homeownership. And equally importantly, I think we have to ask, why do we see the failure to increase homeownership as a policy issue and a public responsibility, whereas the inability to increase tenant ownership is, oh, it's a tenant issue. Like, people just don't know how to move through the process. So I hope that's what this conversation starts to shift, right? Is how do we reframe and see our collective responsibility in building out the infrastructure, oftentimes in those 4 buckets that I described earlier, but really thinking about a big picture, like what is the machine that needs to exist, the industry that must exist to support tenants in moving through the system, just like we have to support prospective buyers into homeownership.
I think that's exactly right, and it's something that again, we have wonderful, amazing historic tools in DC and resources, and we are far, I wouldn't say ahead, but we have had them in practice for a longer time than many other jurisdictions, and yet we don't have a coordinated system to utilize tenant opportunity to purchase to ensure that residents can become homeowners, or to ensure that those buildings will stay affordable. I think we're close to getting there. I think it's, as you said, it's creating like more of that infrastructure, investing more in that infrastructure, investing in all the tools that we know that work, and coordinating those efforts, and making it a priority. So this idea of social housing, and I think that it's gained some traction and popularity in DC as well. Again, like building on the foundation of limited equity co-ops and tenant opportunity purchase, which in and of themselves meet the definition of social housing, very tenant-led, very community-based development, with strong voice, led by the residents themselves, and then deeply invested in affordable housing over time that looks very much like the social housing model. When you create a limited equity co-op, or let's say a limited equity co-op paired with a land trust or city held land with long-term affordability requirements. And I think those are within reach. It's just creating that pathway to achieving those goals more holistically and making it a reality for more very low income renters who have gotten the short end of the benefit from reinvestment and redevelopment of our cities. So yeah, it's a question still unanswered. How do we get there?
I wanted to ask Tram to jump in a little bit and talk about how some of the campaigns around the country that are formulating new policies to try to get them passed are addressing some of these questions that we've talked about recently, the affordability, the encouraging actual purchase by tenants and various things like that. What are the conversations like as they're deciding what the policies they're pushing for look like?
Yeah. I think some of the important pieces are, designing the policy to fit the local market. And I think that question of like, why are we exempting single family homes is an important one. Because in a lot of markets, we're seeing corporate landlords actually target those single family homes. So really questioning like how we can target our benefits to the most vulnerable populations or communities. That's one conversation that's happening. I also think, one of the biggest pieces of conversation in our campaigns is building out that infrastructure, right? What are ways that we can leverage state financing, bonds, city financing, even like pathways of using federal funding for TOPA and COPA for acquisition, rehab, all of that. And it is really dependent on what local resources you have, right? What local financing tools you have. I also think that looking at low-income housing tax credits as, kind of the person in our family that is just there, we don't necessarily like them, but we have to live with them, right? that leveraging that tool, because there are ways that we can impact qualified allocation plans, which are how state housing finance agencies decide where to allocate tax credits. We can start to impact those scorecards and really think about, okay, how do I tell the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency that when they're figuring out how to allocate their tax credits, they actually prioritize deeper affordability, they prioritize nonprofit developers, and prioritize buildings that will have a built-in right of first refusal, tenant opportunity to purchase, or community opportunity to purchase, just piece and when the building is sold. So I think that's one pathway also that folks can be thinking about creatively. And then the last thing I'll say is, because I have seen this kind of in the Q&A too, is what is kind of a model policy? And I think that really depends on who you're asking, right? You ask a real estate lobby, model policy is no policy. If you ask me, it's probably the one that has the longest on-ramp for tenant acquisition, with the most funding. And I think what we have to consider is that what has been won and passed is not necessarily what is possible and the best, right? Because those policies that have been fought for have had to negotiate with a very powerful lobby that influences their legislators, which is not to say that they are great policies to have, but I think Ellen and Jose would maybe agree that there are ways to make it stronger. And, you know, if they were talking to people who were starting from scratch, they would recommend specific elements of policy design that would be stronger than what they were able to win in their communities. So what exists is not necessarily best practice, because what we have won is what we're able to win with all the odds against us.
Great, and we're almost at the end. I think I'll ask Ellen, Roshan, Jose, if you have any last comments. Please keep it short because we're almost at the end. I'll pass to Ellen first. You're on mute.
Sorry, and no pressure to close us out. No, I think it just, this has been a really interesting conversation. It's a good conversation. I really appreciate Nonprofit Quarterly for putting together this panel and for bringing us all together in the room from similar but unique perspectives to discuss this. And how do we consider the way forward? I think that this is really our challenge right now of this time. It's a challenging economic time. It's a challenging time economically for very low-income families. We still see many residents, very low-income residents, being displaced from neighborhoods and communities as a result of development. And there's even, when they do have opportunities to purchase. And so how do we hone all of the policies and all of the kind of well-intended policies, like promoting Black home ownership, like promoting tenant and community ownership, like social housing, and that engages residents long-term in the direction of their housing, excuse me, and their quality of life, and ultimately, ensure that we have more equitable communities. And I think that there are some low-hanging fruit in terms of how we could change policy and change, and better coordinate between the sectors. And then I think there are some, more ideal sort of, visionary goals that we have as people who work in the society to promote equity and inclusion, that will take a lot of concerted effort.
Thanks, Ellen. Roshan, do you have like 10 seconds that you want to last comment?
Yeah, I will just say I think that TOPA is really crucial for providing agency to tenants at a time when most of the solutions that get promoted don't really have anything to do with tenants. They're sort of like not the main actors of the story when all we talk about is the importance of market rate development. And they're really important for preserving affordability. And I would also add that in DC, according to the report that CNHED put out, the amount of units being purchased have precipitously declined. I don't know if it was specifically because of the single family carve out, but around the time that carve out happened, I'm looking at the stats, went from an average of 1,469 units annually to 415 the next year. In 2020, it was 342. So these are real issues that we have to grapple with.
Thanks, Roshan. Jose, I'll give you like 10 seconds.
Sounds good. Yes, we are just hopefully we continue learning from all our mistakes with throughout this process, but prioritize funding. No matter where we get with the policy, if we don't get the funding that we need, we can't not do this work. So continue to advocate for funding. Here in California, we have $20 billion regional bond that is in November, and we cannot do anything without that funding. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jose. And I want to thank Miriam Axel-Lute from Shelterforce, who helped come up with this topic and co-organize this entire webinar. Thanks again to everyone, Roshan, Jose, Tram, Ellen, Miriam, do you want to say anything last comment?
We, and I suppose probably NPQ, are going to continue to cover TOPA. So if you want to subscribe to our newsletter, you will get future content as things develop on these fronts.
Okay. And thanks to everyone for attending this webinar. And please do fill out the survey that will come up on your screen when you exit this webinar. Thanks so much.